Do 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 boo 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 boo. Hey everybody, welcome to the brunt of it. I'm your host Joel Van Brunt. Just got a notification my stream quality is lower, so I apologize. I'm trying to upload some videos. I'll cover that in a second. But welcome to my show. This is episode 32. So I'm 32 episodes into this, starting with my COVID improvement plan. What it was that was an attempt to start live streaming every day or most days and try to get good at it, try to get comfortable, try to provide content and information that people would be interested in hearing. And so far, it's been an amazing experience, great feedback from folks. And I've had some hiccups that I've shared along the way, and I'll share some more. But let's get on to what this is and who I am. If you're gonna outsource your thinking, which we all do to a certain degree anyway, why not do it with somebody you trust like me? But if you're not going to outsource your thinking, why not allow me to point you in the right direction and maybe build your awareness and help you round out your discernment and awareness and the ability to I'll get to that. The ability to control your emotions. So that's the plan. I'm interested in grown-up conversations, not fifth grade recess shouting matches. And that's oftentimes what you guys see here in the political discourse. And who would have thought that the axis of kindness and civility would today become niche? So have you really seen that demonstrated? I have not seen that demonstrated. And I cannot fix my blinds, unfortunately. I have to replace them. I tried to fix them the other day, and I made it worse. But thanks for asking. And I'll get to the brunt of it with the coronavirus here in a second, which is a question commenter. Thanks for joining. So the axis of kindness, we can disagree. We can round out our awareness of other positions and not demonize the other person, not reduce them down to an ad hominem attack, which is often what we see out there in public discourse. So who am I? I have 21 years experience in the military private sectors. I have operated in a number of different areas: aviation, tourism, entertainment, politics, academia, entrepreneurship, government, and the military. And in those capacities, I've spent about 7 years in the executive level, and I've managed up to 290 people-ish, and I've hired, fired, and recruited. So anyway, I think that experience might offer some different perspectives for you to consider. I've lived in 16 different places across 8 states, and I've actually worked out of 12 states in the capacities that I've just mentioned. So I've experienced a lot of the country's culture, whether it's New England culture, whether it's the Southern culture, the Midwest, or the left coast, or here currently in Hawaii. People who seriously trust a guy on Periscope. Gotta love them. Hey, love them. Mostly family and friends right now, by the way, but thanks for joining us. All right, so I'm here to help guide you through the fog of war. I talk about this a lot if you've seen previous episodes. The fog of war, what is that? That is basically we're walking around in life and we have information out there that's competing for our attention. We're not sure which one's right, which is accurate. The information might be contradictory. It might be confusing, and it results in this fog of war. And we still have to operate in this fog of war, whether it's at work or whether it's in our personal lives, our decisions on what kinds of ideas we buy off on. And so I'm here to help do that, help guide you through that philosophically, politically, and culturally. My process a little bit about preparing this. I kind of cover the news, go through New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, Fox News, Vox, National Review, and then my favorite aggregator is Real Clear Politics, because they will put me in touch with a whole slew of other outlets, Washington Examiner, New York Post, and then some of the lesser markets, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times, Dallas Morning Star, and several others. And so I kind of go through and I do a wide look. I probably look at between 15, 20 articles in areas that I'm interested in. And I talk about how they fit into my big picture scope on things. So that's the process. And really what I'm trying to instill in the audience is a couple principles. The principle of awareness, which means are you aware of different angles on certain issues? The principles of discernment. So basically, are you taking captive the information coming in, and are you interrogating it to find out whether it's there to make you better, to inform you, or just to persuade you, or to persuade you towards a point of view through argument, or is it just to kind of activate your emotional reaction and get you to fit it into your confirmation bias and existing belief structure that you already have? So interrogation. So that's the principle of discernment. And then finally, the principle of sticky narratives. And what I mean by that is we all have data points with life. We come across ideas, we come across people, and we have limited data points. We take those data points, we draw a string right through them, which is our narrative. And then that becomes sticky. That anchors in our mind about what truth is, what reality is, what's right, what's wrong. And it's funny because when you get presented information that may push against that narrative, those narratives tend to be sticky. Thus the sticky narrative analogy. And we tend to either reject or dismiss information that might oppose our narratives, or we just ignore them. So you'll see that in people when this cognitive dissonance kind of starts, when they're trying to hold on to their narrative, but they're realizing new information that's starting to challenge those narratives. Okay, so starting big to small, I talk a lot about this COVID improvement plan, trying to get better at a skill, trying to better yourself in the stay-at-homes and the lockdowns across the country. I dabbled in the stock market with a simulated account, and I also started this live stream. Now, I did experience some setbacks. So I've been uploading these to my YouTube channel under my name, but I thought I'd brand it to the brunt of it and start a new channel with that. But it doesn't have any of the videos, and it won't let me transfer videos from one channel to another. So I'm in the process of re-uploading all 31 episodes onto that new channel. And on top of that, I started to try to upload the recent episodes to that channel a few days ago, and I didn't realize that I hadn't, selected the verification aspect that allows me to upload longer than 15 minutes. So most of my videos are over 15 minutes. That means that the upload dropped, and I wasn't able to get the video uploaded, which kind of stinks because I lost some momentum. There are some people listening to me, fairly routinely and checking in, and then all of a sudden, I had 3 in a row that didn't get uploaded. So I fixed that, and I'm in the process of uploading all those now, which is one reason why the stream right now is probably a little bit slow, is because I'm uploading in the background, which is not a good idea for streaming. But that's okay. We'll get through it together. This will be uploaded on YouTube, and I'm looking out to other ways to get this content out there. One thing I've been looking at recently is this place called locals.com, and it allows almost like a subscription model to content creators to have people support their channel. So it's like combining Patreon with YouTube all together, and not necessarily YouTube, but any kind of content generation. So looking at that's out of Dave Rubin and his group, who is trying to bring that up. And there's some big names on there already. Not many names, but there's some big names on already. And I'm hoping maybe they'll let me join in and start posting my content over there. So I thought I'd also open with a little thing that I like to instill in my direct reports. Communication is a challenge in any organization, and perhaps you've been a part of an organization and you've experienced communication challenges. A lot of friction and problems with your team or cross departments or with your leadership can result from a lack of communication, poor communication, imprecise communication, over communication. It can be a whole slew of things. And so what I try to instill in my team is this concept of signals. And signals has to do with communication. You're constantly sending signals to other people in everything you do, whether you realize it or not. So it's intentional, it's unintentional, it's deliberate, it's, didn't even think that signal would get sent. So I try to basically teach my team to mind their signals. And what I mean by that is, understand that everything you do, everything you say, everything people see you do is going to send signals. And you want to be aware of the possible signals that are sent. And you also want to validate that the signals you want to send are the ones getting received, especially if you're a manager or a leader in a company. And if you are, and you've come across the concept of managing up the chain of command, managing your boss just as much as managing your subordinates, you'll understand that the signals to your boss matter tremendously. And if you're sending signals, you want to validate that those signals are getting interpreted correctly. Because too often, you may not even realize, or two people of your team may not realize that the signals they're sending to each other are just not working out, and they don't realize that there's a negative impression happening from these signals. So I challenge people to be deliberate with their signals, and that's verbal, written, body language, eye contact, all you name it, any kind of human communication. That is a craft and a skill that you really should hone if you're a leader or manager in an organization. All right, so 2 days ago I talked about cancel culture and this concept of shutting down opposing views, or stopping or diminishing or tearing down the credibility of opposing points of view when looked at it from these three phases of warfare. So strategic, operational, and tactical levels of warfare. And I talked about how that plays itself out with cancel culture and with organizations like Media Matters and others that the sole purpose is to analyze content generation and ideas from the opposing ideological side and remove context, change a few things, and then weaponize the information to attack the credibility of the other side. And we really should be aware that this is happening. This is not theory. This is actually what a lot of organizations do. And if you look at propagandists throughout history, you would find that this is exactly what they do. They weaponize information, and they take out context and they repeat it strong enough until you start to believe it is true. The famous quote from Stalin, you repeat a lie often enough and then it becomes the truth. I think that was Stalin. Anyway, so realize that in today's world, the political discourse, there are actors out there that are weaponizing information. They are maneuvering deliberately to attack the credibility of the other side. Now, this isn't everybody. This certainly isn't everybody, but there's a faction, and they're effective, right? Because especially if they weaponize information, it activates a prior belief. The person receiving it confirms their pre-existing biases. It's almost like appealing to your base. And then all of a sudden, boom, you've got, momentum in this kind of groupthink along one ideological stream in the conversation. And it can happen on both sides too. So I wanted to, lead with that because I think we're going to see a little bit of that in today's discussion. And I also went over a Quillette piece that talks about defending free thought. And, the principles that I talk about routinely, the principle of awareness, discernment, and sticky narratives, that's going to help us to discern when the information coming in maybe was weaponized, maybe was manipulated, either removing context or some sort of opinion or word choice or emotional appeal that is there designed for an effect on you, the reader. And if you're aware of those things, then perhaps you can mitigate against them, activating your confirmation bias receivers. And maybe you can realize that, wait a second, I'm not getting the full picture. That goes back to the principle of awareness. Too often I've seen articles, this is almost every article you read. There is barely a mention of the opposing side of the issue. There's never a discussion of the arguments. If there is, it's a weak argument so that the writer, the author, can dismiss it easily. And then you, the reader, can go along and say, oh yeah, those idiots on the other side don't know what they're talking about. Obviously, this is what they think, and it's a caricature of what they actually think. So anyway, I want to set that stage for discussions going on. Light news. There's a really cool story that came up that said that the world deadlift record was beaten by Hafthor Bjornsson, who's a Game of Thrones star. Now, I watched the Game of Thrones, not religiously, but I watched the whole series and very much enjoyed it. And he's a massive, massive person. And so he deadlifted 1,104 pounds. And I don't know if you deadlift in the audience. I've deadlifted. It's one of the best exercises, full body exercises you can do, period. It's an amazing, amazing exercise. And I love it. It's one of my staples. It's been one of my staples for 20 years. And when he lifts this 1,104 pounds, he makes it look like it's easy. And if you look at the previous record, which I think was set 2 years ago, the lifter, and I forget his name, but he's a famous strong man. When he lifts it, he does it successfully. He puts down the weight and he almost passes out. Like he's exerting so much energy to try to lift this much weight that it looks like it almost gets him. In contrast, Hafthor, when he just lifted this up, I mean, it just looked like he was, it's another Saturday. So I thought that was pretty cool. I wanted to give him some mad props on busting the deadlift record, 1,104 pounds. That's insane. That's insane. All right. So getting into COVID-19, this is the question. What's the brunt of coronavirus? By the COVID-19 Virus. All right, let's get into this. So there's an interesting piece in the New York Times that talks about the COVID-19 riddle. And this basically analyzes why you have such wide range of results in neighboring countries. Like they look at Iraq versus Iran. They look at a couple of other countries, Dominican Republic versus Haiti and Indonesia and other places, Southeast Asia. And they're trying, in Malaysia, Indonesia, they're trying to figure out why neighboring countries, one country will have a really bad outbreak and the neighboring country will have hardly any outbreak, and what's going on. And the short answer is I don't know, but this kind of adds that fog of war that we see in COVID-19, that we've been trying to clarify the information over the last several weeks with antibody tests and new information coming in all the time. But what's interesting is this article identified basically four plus things that may be differentiators in outcomes in these neighboring countries that haven't been hit so hard, like say in Italy or Spain. Number one, youth. Okay, there might be some populations that are more youthful. Number two, culture. So certain cultures like South Korea, you've probably seen this in the news, where they socially distance just naturally more. Heat and light. So you've probably heard in the news that heat and ultraviolet light will kill the virus in very short order. So if you're in a country that is warmer, has more sunlight perhaps, you're outdoors more, that could have something to do with it. And then the fourth one is perhaps early lockdown. So the hypothesis is countries that had earlier lockdowns might see a lower COVID case rate and fatality rate because of those early lockdowns. So it's attempting to explain what we're seeing, but the short answer is we really don't know. We can just speculate. Certain things we can probably be more sure than others. Like, for example, I do think logically it makes sense that, we've seen that it doesn't affect the younger generations like the older generations. So if you have a younger population versus an older population like Italy, that could explain partially the number of cases. And then culture, South Korea has gone through the SARS thing in the past and other Southeast Asian countries. And so they've had this social distancing concept in their culture for a while now. And for us in the US, we're just starting to get our minds around it. And then heat and light. So that makes sense as well, especially with the experts saying that the virus can only live a couple minutes in UV light or less. So that makes sense. The early lockdowns, I'm not so sure. Maybe that just flattens a curve like the original intent of the lockdowns were. And then Scott Gottlieb and Scott Atlas, two Scotts that I follow on Twitter. You should too. Scott Gottlieb, former FDA chief. He talks about maybe this is the new normal, that we're going to have, roughly 2,000 deaths a day while we're trying to work on this vaccine and trying to work on testing. So he describes that as a new normal in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. And then Scott Atlas at the Hoover Institution, he has an article in The Hill, and he basically lays out the case to reopen based on logic. What does he say? He says, how to reopen society using medical science and logic. So this is Scott Atlas, and I've covered him a few times. He's been out in various publications making his views known. So he proposes a few things. Focus on the most vulnerable. That shouldn't surprise anybody. Nursing home patients as the primary one. And before I do that, I want to, the bias of reassuring the public about reentry is repeating the facts about the threat and who it targets. By now, studies from Europe and the US all suggest that the overall fatality rate is far lower than early estimates. And we know who to protect, because the disease, by the evidence, is not equally dangerous across the population. In Michigan's Oakland County, 75% of deaths were in those over 70 years old. 91% were in people over 60, similar to what was noted in New York. And younger, healthier people have virtually zero risk of death and little risk of serious disease. As I have noted before, under 1% of New York City's hospitalizations have been patients under 18 years of age. And less than 1% of deaths at any age are in the absence of underlying conditions. So that's the facts. So first, focus on the most vulnerable. He talks about the nursing home patients and testing everybody who goes in and goes out of there. Second, mild symptoms of the illness should self-isolate, not necessarily urgency to test them. Assume they have the infection instead. If they hospitalize, then you test them. Third, open all the schools. Okay, children have nearly zero risk of serious illness from COVID-19. Exceptions exist, as they do with virtually every other clinically encountered infection, but that should not outweigh the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Okay, fourth, open businesses, including restaurants and offices, but require new standards for hygiene, disinfection, and sanitation via enforcement, more stringent regulations than in the past. It is reasonable to post warnings for customers who are older or in other ways vulnerable. Avoid unnecessary requirements for spacing of customers, though. It is not logical that otherwise healthy adults, especially younger age groups, should be isolated to maintain a 6-foot spacing from each other. If the infection is still prevalent, socializing among these low-risk groups represents the opportunity for developing widespread immunity and eradicating the threat. So he's actually advocating for less stringent social distancing towards the end of herd immunity, which is kind of the route that Sweden has taken. They do have some social distancing, but they didn't close everything down. Fifth, public transportation, open that up. Sixth, open up the parks and beaches. And then finally, implement prioritizing testing for 3 groups: nursing home workers, healthcare workers, and first responders, and patients in hospitals with respiratory symptoms or fevers. So this is a way to kind of get the tests that we have available into the marketplace to provide the most bang for the buck. So that's Scott Atlas. I think that's pretty reasonable. I've been reading a lot of his work, and that seems pretty reasonable. Scott Gottlieb also, good stuff from him. So those are the 2 Scotts with what they think we should do. Now, sadly, we've all seen the politicization of COVID-19. And so this happened with Dr. Birx over the weekend, being interviewed on Fox News Sunday, and the Washington Post had an article on that interview. And this is the headline, and this is what's so interesting about this. So, headline: Birx's Fox News Sunday interview lays bare the discord in Trump's coronavirus response. So now, one of the tells of, or one of the challenges in today's media environment is you need to make sure that the headline matches the article. And if the article doesn't match the headline, then why was the headline written in the way it was? Well, to sell clicks, to get, sell newspapers, whatever. So understand that there is a financial incentive to activate emotion in your brain to make you click, to make you take action, call to action, as we call it in the industry. And it's going to make you think, if you're not careful, if you don't have the discernment and awareness, you're going to just have that come in and confirm your biases. And you're not going to check necessarily, because none of us have time to read all of the articles, but we do scan headlines routinely. So you may not know that the body doesn't match the headline. So Birx told host Chris Wallace that, quote, "Our projections have always been between 100,000 and 240,000 American lives lost, and that's with the full mitigation and us learning from each other of how to socially distance." And then it contrasts that with what Trump said, with his previous estimate of 50 or 60,000, which he upgraded to 100,000 yesterday. So she's basically asked about the protesters in Michigan, and she makes a quote: "It's devastatingly worrying to me personally, because if they go home and infect their grandmother or their grandfather who has a comorbid condition, and they have a serious or an unfortunate outcome, they will feel guilty for the rest of their lives," she said. "So we need to protect each other at the same time we're voicing our discontent." So this quote was taken, kind of as the quote that shows the discord between the Trump administration and how to deal with this. This is a medical expert, highly respected, who is publicly saying that the protesters are, she's personally uncomfortable with it. And the president has been, through tweeting and his messaging saying, "Hey, I get why people are protesting." And, the whole Free Michigan tweet that made everybody crazy a couple weeks ago, the Liberate Michigan. So anyway, you put this out, and this came out, this coverage of Fox News Sunday, this came out right after another Washington Post article that talks about, I got to find the title because I scrolled down. So This one is called "34 Days of Pandemic, Inside Trump's Desperate Attempts to Reopen America." And it's supposed to be this in-depth, exclusive look at, the last 34 days and, what, the messaging and what's been happening. And it's so funny because each paragraph, the sentence is negative, mostly negative towards Trump. And maybe this is just my lens, but I'm just going to read you a few of these opening sentences. For Trump, whose decision-making has been guided largely by his re-election prospects, the analysis, coupled with Hassett's grim predictions of economic calamity, provided justification to pivot to where he preferred to be, cheering an economic revival. So just kind of a phrase thrown in there, whose decision-making has been guided largely by his re-election prospects. Okay. Yeah, sure. I'm sure re-election would enter into it, but this is making it sound like that's his sole, his sole decision-making is being guided by his re-election prospects. And we don't have enough information to know that. You can kind of assume that that's the case, but you don't have enough information. Okay, so then I want to skip down to another one. It's going to go. It's going to leave. It's going to be gone. It's going to be eradicated, the president said Wednesday, hours after his son-in-law claimed the administration's response had been a great success story. So he's an optimistic person. He's messaging optimistically, but this is in contrast to setting the current death rate above the Vietnam War. So there's a comparing and contrasting that's happening, using existing quotes, removing the context that he's an optimistic person and really wants to encourage the public. And the whole piece just is a regurgitation of left-wing media talking points about the bungling of the whole thing. And so I didn't really learn anything new about it. So determined was Trump to extinguish the deadly virus that he repeatedly embraced fantasy cure-alls and tuned out both the reality that the first wave has yet to significantly recede and the possibility of a potentially worse second wave in the fall. Has he done that? Has he tuned those out? I haven't seen that. Has he tuned them out? I haven't seen it, and I watch what he says pretty closely. The president sought to obscure major problems by trying to recast them as triumphs. He repeatedly boasted, for instance, that the United States has conducted more tests than any other country, even though the total of 6.75 million is a fraction of the 2 million to 3 million tests per day that many experts say we need to reopen safely. Okay, let's say, I'm just going to do a hypothetical. Let's say it takes August to get 2 million to 3 million tests per day. Does that mean we don't reopen? And is that really what the other side wants to say? I think the other side is, I think they want to reopen as well. I think everybody agrees. This is kind of like a false conflict, a false dilemma. I think both sides want to reopen safely. We want to protect our most vulnerable. But politics is still politics. So any kind of information opportunity to attack and demean your political opponent is going to be taken. And I feel like this article is a good example of that. So trying to paint it like we are grossly still underprepared. Okay, and then it's a quote by Kathleen Sebelius, former Kansas governor and health secretary in the Obama administration. "We wasted 2 months denying it. We're now wasting another 2 months by just dithering around." So this is an authoritative quote in this article designed to elicit a response. And is that true? Is that true? We wasted 2 months denying it. Did we waste 2 months denying it? I assume she's referring to January, February. And if you go back and look at the timeline, we were in a fog of war. Certainly there were people who were worried about it, and they said so publicly. But there's also a lot of people who publicly were not worried about it, and very publicly, including Anthony Fauci, including none other than Nancy Pelosi as recently as February 24th. And Trump issued the recommended stay-at-home before many of the states locked down, including New York. So did we deny it? Do we waste that time? And I covered in great detail this timeline that the CDC had in February, which suggested that some of their work was just staying inside the silo of the CDC, and it wasn't clear how much of it was getting out and affecting upper-level decision makers. And there were assurances inside CDC to the public, to the press, that some of the problems with the early testing was getting resolved, and they were replacing out components and whatnot. And that went all the way to the end of February. So then when we had all these problems with the test in March, as they were getting rolled out, that got laid at the hands of Trump. But really, it could have been a bureaucratic issue inside the CDC. And I've been critical of the CDC on this show, and I think that they have a lot to answer for. So now we're wasting another 2 months just dithering around. Is that what we're doing? Dithering around. Do you think that we've just been dithering around? I mean, seriously, if you think that, I would submit that you haven't been really paying attention to all the information out there. Maybe you are latching on to quotes like this and it's confirming your pre-existing biases. I've watched the press briefings and I've stayed up to date. I have a friend who's in the industry who has been hired by the government to do certain, to build certain PPE type things. So I have some knowledge in this area and friends who do business out of China. And I did not see dithering around. I saw a huge activation of public-private sector cooperation, which is fantastic. Probably unlike anything that's happened in our history. So it's just a different method than perhaps the other side would prefer. They prefer more of a government takeover, maybe of industry or production or whatnot. But this administration chose a different course, and it seems to be that everybody was activated to that degree. Now, of course, there's friction. There's also big federalist discussion of what's the state's responsibilities versus what's the federal government's responsibility. Those are all healthy, very healthy discussions. Okay, so, and then she goes on, that's really the story in all this, or this is an outside advisor to the Trump administration. Quote, the states are just doing everything on their own. Really? Are they doing everything on their own? Everything on their own. So the states have not, the governors, the Democratic governors have not publicly thanked the administration for receiving PPE and receiving federal aid. Is that the case? There's been no press conferences by Democratic governors thanking the administration. I've seen them. Have you? So the states are just doing everything on their own. No, that's not true. That's not true. Maybe that's hyperbole, but it's certainly not helpful. Okay, so it does present a little bit of the other side. White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany agreed President Trump's swift and unprecedented action to save American lives, she said, pointing out that the governors from both parties have praised some of the administration's work, which is true. Okay. Do you remember the ventilator shortage that New York City was going to have? Did that end up happening? I don't think it did. And does the public know how many hospitals have been overwhelmed? Have we maxed out any hospital in terms of their beds? I don't know the answer. There might be one in New York City, but we do know that the Mercy and the field hospital that was set up in New York City wasn't used nearly to the capacity that it was there for. So we haven't really seen this overwhelming of the healthcare system. So the social distancing and the stay-at-homes actually seem to have prevented that. All right. So anyway, I thought I'd just cover some of that. So then the Washington Post has another op-ed by Gloria Jackson. She's 75. And she feels like she's been left alone. And certainly the psychological and emotional anxiety that occurs in these things is real. But I think that this article reveals some things more about the writer than about the situation with the country. And I'm just going to pick it up where I think the pertinent paragraph is. So this is by Gloria Jackson. I think she's in Michigan, although I'm not, or no, Minnesota. Maybe she's in Minnesota. So I'm going to pick it up. I've never been this angry, and it's an ugly way to feel. Maybe when you don't get to see everybody for weeks, emotions get bottled up and have nowhere to go. I get sucked into Facebook, and I keep scrolling down from one thing to the next, yelling at my computer as the posts get more and more insane. Mike Pence was just here in Minnesota visiting patients at the Mayo Clinic, and he went against their policy and refused to wear a mask. It's like, really? How arrogant can you be? Next, it's someone posting pictures of people crowded together like sardines at a beach in California. You idiots! Do you care about anyone but yourself? Then it's the president saying it might be a good idea to inject some kind of bleach or disinfectant. No, thank you, but you go right ahead if you want to poison yourself. Then it's the militia group taking over the state capitol. It's doctors who have to wear garbage bags instead of gowns. It's that we still don't have enough tests. It's how at least most of the deaths are people over 70 with pre-existing conditions. Oh, what a relief. Who cares about them? It's some stockbroker or whatever saying the elderly are holding the country back from reopening, and maybe it's their patriotic duty to be sacrificed for the sake of the economy. Sorry to be an inconvenience to your financial portfolio. Sorry, I'm still breathing. So it enrages me. I spent my career working at the federal government at Veterans Affairs. I raised my kids by myself. Okay, so she's obviously led a good life. She's raised her kids. She's worked in public service. But the anger, I've talked about anger and how any kind of strong emotion blinds us to information that might be relevant to how we think about things. And this is a textbook example of somebody who is, in my view, as an outside observer, I've never met her, but she's letting this anger lead her mind into conclusions about strangers that could be an error. Do you guys see that? So is it the case that Mike Pence was arrogant and that's why he didn't wear the mask? Is that why? Do we know that? Was there any public saying about that? Can we imagine any other reason why Mike Pence would not have worn a mask? Can we just imagine it? Or people congregating at the beach in California. Can we imagine another explanation for why that might occur? If I'm correct in my timeline, this is shortly after the press conference about how UV light has a big part in killing the virus. And so if you're outside in the sun, number one, that's healthy for your immune system because you're building vitamin T and vitamin D through your skin. But number two, if the virus gets out, through a sneeze or a cough, it doesn't last very long, less than minutes. So maybe that's why. Maybe people need to be healthy and see the sun emotionally, psychologically. So there's a whole thing that's getting missed in a rant like this, which is the other side, which is when is a cure worse than the disease? And this person obviously doesn't think that we're there yet. And I would submit that that's just simply a lack of awareness of the information. The UN came out and said that 130 million people will be on the brink of starvation by the end of this year because of the global shutdown. 130 million people. How many would COVID kill if we didn't do any social distancing? Somebody do the math. It'd be a lot, but I don't think it would rise to 130 million people. Okay, so that's on one side, and then on the other side by Breitbart. So this is another opinion piece by a gentleman posting to Breitbart, and here's the other side. Quote, "You told us we had to ravage our economy in order to bend the curve. Okay, the curve is bent. Can we go now? No, because now we're moving the goalposts. Now you're spreading on all new pile of BS with this BS about saving lives, and it's still not being safe to go out. Well, riddle me this, Governors Newsom, Cooper, Whitmer, and Evers. When there is zero risk, the healthcare system will crash. And when there is no vaccine or cure, why is it safer to reopen in 2 or 3 weeks or a month or 3 months as opposed to right now? With no vaccine or cure, what's going to change to make things safer between today and May 8th or May 31st or July 6th? Don't tell me we're waiting for warmer weather. First off, no one has said that that's why the lockdowns have been extended. Secondly, Dr. Fauci has recently said, you must assume that the virus will continue to do its thing when the weather gets warm. And I believe him. Besides, we're also being told the virus could roar back in the fall, which should only add to the urgency to free us today. Before we might have to hole up again, let us get back to the normal for as long as possible. Let us make as much money as possible. Whether you reopen your store in late May or on May 1st or May 31st or July 6th, this incurable disease will still be out there waiting, which means it will be just as risky to reopen on May 31st as it is today. So why wait? And so the logic on the other side is, wait a second. We don't have a cure. That might come by the end of the year if we're lucky. We don't have any viable treatment. Okay, there's some experimentals. Remdesivir is the most recent example, and so maybe those will pan out. But in the absence of that, we don't have a viable treatment that's well known yet, and we know the testing is still limping its way along. Okay, that's the situation. That's the fog of war we're in. So the case that this gentleman is writing is, okay, let's imagine we don't have a viable treatment and we don't have a viable cure. So are we waiting for testing? We're waiting for testing to just so we know we have COVID and people have COVID when they get out of lockdown. They're going to know they have COVID anyway when they develop symptoms and have to go to the hospital if that's their case, or when they self-isolate. So he's making the case that hey, we wanted to flatten the curve. We wanted to prevent New York City from getting overrun in the hospitals. We sent ventilators there. We sent field hospitals, and that worked. And now we've kind of gotten over the hump, at least in certain areas. So what's the deal? What's the story? Now you're moving goalposts. Now the goal is becoming minimize death, or no death, and eliminate the virus. And that wasn't the original agreement. The original agreement was let's this is a pandemic. We're going to have to try for herd immunity at some point. It's inevitable, but we can slow it down and flatten that curve. And now it's being adjusted on the other side's from the other side's point of view. So I wanted to set those against each other. And then I did want to cover this really interesting piece by Real Clear Politics that wanted to set the record straight on PPE and the stockpiles. So I'm just going to read this because I hadn't heard this viewpoint before. I'd heard subtle parts of it, but this had the most details that I had heard in terms of the stockpile. So I want to go back and do this. Okay. In 2005, President Bush and his administration put in place a comprehensive national pandemic preparedness and response plan. Quote, "If we wait for a pandemic to appear, it will be too late to prepare," Bush said in a speech at the National Institutes of Health in November 2005. "To respond to a pandemic, we need medical personnel and adequate supplies of equipment." This strategic initiative was an intense 3-year effort lasting from late 2005 through January 2009, including $7 billion in funding, and created national stockpiles of critical supplies such as face masks, ventilators, and other PPE. When the Bush administration came to an end in January 2009, so did the focus on pandemic preparedness on the pandemic preparedness plan. In 2009, the Obama-Biden administration shelved the National Pandemic Response Strategy, eliminated the White House Health and Security Office, and dumped the initial set of pandemic regulations. The Obama administration took pandemics so lightly that one day after declaring a national emergency for health reasons due to H1N1 virus, the White House hosted 2,000 children for a Halloween event despite the virus being a high risk for children. Stockpiles of face masks, syringes, hospital beds, ventilators, and other emergency materials were used for the 2009 H1N1 virus. The stockpiles served their purpose, but were never fully replenished by the Obama-Biden administration. For instance, the Washington Post reported the stockpile was never replaced, even though almost 100 million masks were distributed in 2009. Similarly, the Obama-Biden administration did not restock the supply of ventilators. How bad is this record on pandemic planning? Even Joe Biden doesn't want to be identified with the effort. It wasn't, and then there's a link to an article which I have not read yet. It wasn't just supplies. Building on the pandemic response plan, the CDC recommended in December 2008 to the Obama-Biden transition team that it expand regional disease detection centers. The recommendation was ignored. Over 4 years, the NIH and CDC saw their funding cut by more than $1 billion. This after the Obama-Biden administration had just emerged from the H1N1 crisis. In 2014, the Obama-Biden administration got another opportunity to get pandemic preparedness and response right when the Ebola virus threat erupted. Again, it didn't respond with any sense of urgency. The Obama-Biden point man for Ebola, Christopher Kirchhoff, conceded, "We didn't follow through." The great challenge with stockpile of any commodity is that by its nature, it's stored away but ready to be accessed. The same is true of facts and history. With facts out of sight and out of mind, people try to rewrite what has not been recalled. Still, the facts remain. I've experienced this firsthand with this pandemic. Just a few weeks ago, national media rushed out stories about a single confirmed coronavirus case at the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, which I run. The media onslaught included a speculation that the president, vice president, and about half the cabinet might be infected. Reporters from outlets like the Washington Post, New York Times, and CNN sought to create panic among the thousands of attendees and to violate an individual's private medical information in efforts to out the patient. The coverage was hysterical, not based on facts, while at the same time, the Washington Post and New York Times were making light of the virus in their own pages. Yet Fox News is the irresponsible media outlet? ? Okay. So this is by Matt Schlapp. And so he goes through some facts about the Obama-Biden administration. And, it's true. If the public doesn't have a wide grasp of the facts of what happened in the last 10, 15 years, there is such a thing as a short memory. And we've all seen this, right? That the public's memory will fade about an event. And then 5 years when a similar event on the other side comes back, all the hypocrisy comes out. And people don't remember, necessarily the particulars of an historical event that's 5, 10, 15 years in the past. They don't. So this is intended to raise awareness of what the last 10, 15 years looked like, going back to Bush, Bush W, and looking at that. And so you widen the aperture, and then the critique of President Trump from 2017 to the present day with preparedness and whatnot changes, doesn't it? I mean, doesn't it change a little bit? So I offer that for your consideration. Now, that's a little bit about the politicization. It's a long word. Okay. There's a horrible story in the New York Times about this Georgia jogger who was killed by an ex-cop and his son. It's a really, really troubling story. This jogger was jogging in the neighborhood, and I guess he resembled an individual who had been robbing the neighborhood. And so this former police officer called his son, and then they drove after this jogger. And then the jogger, probably feeling threatened, either ran or had an altercation with the two gentlemen, and then they shot him. That's awful. That's horrible. And I just submit that, this time of lockdown and stay at home. Now, Georgia is starting to open up, but, activating people's emotions, like the two articles, the elderly woman in the Washington Post and the Breitbart rant on reopening, really activating people's emotions in a major way doesn't go without consequences. And I think the elevated emotional state can lead to these kinds of horrible tragedies, where you already have the baseline stress level in society elevated. And so we need to tone down the rhetoric. We need to have the niceness, the civility come back. And we need to not castigate the other side as evil or ill-intentioned. When to do so, we are likely removing information from our sticky narrative that is pertinent to that conclusion. All right, so interesting things about federalism have come up. And The Atlantic has a really, really interesting piece. I like... There's certain publications I like now. That The Atlantic has some differences. Did I not open it? I hope I opened it. Okay, there's that. I must not have opened it. Let me see if I can find it. Well, I'm just going to open it now. Okay, so this piece is called The End of the Imperial Presidency. And you might read that and think that it's referring specifically about Trump, but it's really not. It's referring to some historical kind of imperial presidency that's had a lot of federal power compared to state-level power. And the subtitle is, By Ceding Control Over the Government's Pandemic Response, Trump is allowing American governors to flex new muscles. And this kind of validates my belief that some really interesting federal discussions have come up over the last 6 weeks about what the role of the state government is, what the role of the federal government is in this kind of response. And it's really easy when you have those two parties at the table to coordinate on response, because if there's a failure, you just do this. That's the oldest trick in the book. So it should be normal for us to expect finger pointing between the state and the federal level. Now, if you see a finger pointing happen in public, does that mean that that's actually the truth? Does that mean that that's actually the case? I would say no, because we don't really have all the information. We only have partial stories. And if we have a prior belief, we're just going to get more firm in that belief that, it's the federal failings of the Trump administration, or it's, the Democrats just passing the buck, for not being prepared themselves. Okay, so Democrats have long feared that in a national crisis, President Trump would seize the chance to stretch his powers and sweep aside constitutional restraints. I remember them thinking that. Yet as the pandemic rages, Trump may be creating an unanticipated legacy. By ceding some control to the states, he's allowing the nation's governors to reacquire executive muscle that has withered in the age of the imperial presidency. However inadvertent, Trump may have set in motion a durable shift that positions states as more of a counterweight to the chief executive. Trump blustered at one point that Democratic governors who opposed him were committing mutiny. If so, the mutineers faced no reprisal, an incentive to act on their own again. Trump's posture has forced governors to confront a worldwide crisis they wouldn't have imagined would be theirs to solve. They've had to venture into chaotic global marketplace to hunt for masks and ventilators. They forged alliances to figure out the smartest ways to reopen their economy and curb the virus's spread. And they're building systems to help them cope with future pandemics. Good. Good, good, good. Now, I just want to back up a little bit because I want to make a comment on they've had to venture into a chaotic global marketplace to hunt for masks and ventilators. Okay. Name me a product that you can buy right now that isn't in the global marketplace, that you, the customer, whatever state you're in, I'm in Hawaii. So when I go onto Amazon and I buy a product, even if it's an American company, likely that's being shipped from China or made in China and shipped to the US in a warehouse. Okay. Or drop shipped from China or drop shipped from Vietnam or drop shipped from Mexico or somewhere in South America. So, making it sound like this is out of the box that state governments would have to shop on the global marketplace is kind of ridiculous in my view. Yes, of course. That's how everybody shops. That's how everybody shops. Now, can the federal government play a role in leveraging supply chains from other countries? Absolutely. And to my knowledge, I saw signals that was happening. But of course, I don't have all the information at my disposal for that. So this is a really interesting piece, and it talks about the friction between the federal government and the state government. And I think that this is good because I think that, frankly, a lot of power over time constitutionally has been ceded to the executive. So the legislature doesn't want to legislate anymore. They want to pass over the ability to legislate to the executive departments and cabinet and different areas in the executive through regulation. So that's why you have this whole regulatory scheme that comes down from the executive branch that aren't laws passed by Congress. So if you violate a regulation from the executive branch, you're not breaking a law. There's a whole regulatory, law that's very different and ambiguous from the guaranteed rights that you have as a citizen for congressional laws. And there's the comment process, and those who, I've been in aviation for a long time, so the federal aviation regulations I'm very familiar with. And there's a comment process for new regulations, and then they incorporate all that data into into the thing. And you can go to jail for violating a regulation. You can go to jail, and all pilots know this intimately. So that's not passed by Congress. Those are regulations passed by the executive branch. So there's like this handing over the reins to the executive. And I think that the states have done the same thing to a large degree. They've handed over a lot of power to the federal government when really they know their own states. And I heard it today on another podcast that treating New York and let's say Minnesota the same way doesn't make any sense. The governors are in the best position to know what's best for their state. And this is, I think, the administration's point. So you wouldn't have this one size fits all approach to reopening or to mitigating the epidemic or the pandemic, because each state is different. There's different layouts. There's different population densities throughout the state. So anyway, it was a good piece. I thought that it was in line with this federalism topic that we've been on for a while on this podcast. So there you have it. Go check that out. That's by, did I read the person who wrote it? If I didn't, I apologize, but it's by Peter Nicholas and Kathy Gilsonen. So very good. The end of the imperial presidency. All right. Moving on. So Trump finally revealed in a town hall given by Fox News why he's so hard on the press. And this was reported both in CNN and Fox News. And he basically compared himself to being treated worse than Lincoln, President Lincoln, in terms of his dealings with the press. And then through Fox News, he revealed that the reason he's so hard on them is because if he wasn't, he'd be walked off the stage. So he feels that that the press is so manipulates his words and so attacks him that he would just get walked off the stage if he didn't push back. That's his perception. So how do you account for traveling between states with differing responses? Ooh, that's a good question. I think the state has to deal with that. Let me back up and I'll answer this question. So Louisiana, Texas. So there's been some requirements set by the governors for when people are traveling from, I think in the specific case, Louisiana into Texas, because Louisiana with New Orleans had a much higher outbreak of COVID cases. So I think, here in Hawaii, when you land at the airport, and let's say you have a house here in Hawaii that's, you're only at for part of the year, so you can still travel here. You land, and there's a sign when you leave the airport that says, go straight to your residence or your, wherever you're staying, and stay there for 14 days. Quarantine is in effect. So it's instructing every person who comes out of the airport with that sign. I see it every day because I work out of the airport. And so I think you just got to abide by the state that you're coming into, what their requirements are. And I think each state can kind of set that. So as a governor, I would imagine if I'm in Texas and I see Oklahoma and I see Louisiana and I see New Mexico and I see whatever's above New Mexico, Colorado or Nevada or any of the states kind of up that way, I would just try to figure out what I have to do to protect my population for people coming in. Hopefully that answers your question. That's a good question. Okay, so Trump says he's treated worse than New England. Okay, so New Englanders are in a different batch. I've lived in Boston and I've lived in Washington, D.C. So I know, not in D.C., but Northern Virginia. So I know that whole corridor is very connected. And you're right. I think you have to deal that tri-state area slightly differently. Which again, it makes sense that if you call from a few weeks ago, the governors in the tri-state area and extending up into Massachusetts, they were forming their own council basically to discuss reopening and discuss all those cases. I thought that was perfectly appropriate. And by the way, Washington, Oregon, and California did the same thing, because when you have those regional areas where there's a lot of cross-border travel, you want to get input from all the stakeholders, and you want to have a policy that makes sense for reopening. And Hawaii, you're right. Hawaii is a relatively easy case. I use that example because I know Texas had some restrictions coming across the border from Louisiana. I don't remember the details. I didn't dig into it that much. But okay, so Trump saying he's treated worse than Lincoln, as reported on Fox News, and that he's so hard on the press because he'd be walked off the stage. That's his impression. You can believe him or not. But I thought that was the first time he's really communicated the why behind his what some people would say bullying tactics against the press. Now, of course, his base loves this because he's fighting back against the illegitimate questions from their perspective. And honestly, the questions, I was listening to the pressers for a while. I didn't listen to all of them, but almost every other question was about the past. It was about lessons learned. It was about what would you tell people? Would you do anything different? And fewer of the questions, at least in my recollection, were about going forward and what the path forward looked like. Now, there were some in their defense, but a lot of the questions about the past and trying to ask the question in a way that suggested there was mistakes or whatnot. I think, if I've never been in this position, but I can imagine that if whatever you say about a topic is going to get turned back on you as a negative. So you could go one way and say, oh, I learned all these crazy things. I would have done this differently, that differently. And then the headline would be, Trump admits that he made mistakes and mismanaged the response. So it doesn't matter what he says, it's going to be turned around. Or if he doesn't say that, hey, we were perfect, we did great, we did all these things right. Trump denies that he, screwed up in this horrible. So it's almost like damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? So I think that's the scenario that he's in, for better or for worse. And so if we're evaluating his communication style, which a lot of my Democratic friends that I debate with on Twitter like to do, then, keep in mind that that's the context. You can't adequately answer his treatment, his interactions with the press by removing that context of it. He just told us what the context was via this town hall. So consider that for educational purposes going forward when you hear Trump's tweets or his press conferences. Now, moving into Michael Flynn, I've been covering this the last few days, and what I found really interesting about the Michael Flynn case, and it didn't really jump out to me until last night, is that there's really only like two or three outlets that are covering the story. There's the National Review, there's the Hill, and maybe the Federalist, maybe Breitbart, but it's not, I haven't seen anything, like literally anything, not saying it's not there because it could be buried in the website, but I haven't seen anything on the New York Times. I haven't seen anything in the Washington Post. I haven't seen anything on CNN. I haven't seen anything on Vox about the Michael Flynn case. And so it would be really nice to see some of that reporting from these major outlets. And if you're not aware, the Washington Post and the New York Times are basically the two most powerful, influential papers in the country. And they influence Fox News and CNN and MSNBC in their coverage. So you can see almost the influence that the print has on the cable news folks. But even Fox News didn't have much on the Michael Flynn case. Maybe in their maybe Sean Hannity did in his broadcast. I'm not sure. I don't really watch cable news that much. So, but really, it's all coming from the Hill National Review. And so the National Review editors today or yesterday had a piece called "The Flynn Case is a Tragedy," and it's a really well written piece. It kind of aggregates a lot of information, and I wanted to read a little bit of it because it really summarizes a lot. So I'm going to skip down past the opening paragraphs and start here. There was no criminal predicate for the probe. Flynn's communications with Sergei Kislyak, then the Russian ambassador to the U.S., during the transition, which set off the whole affair, were entirely proper. The idea that they violated the Logan Act forbidding private interference in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy was always absurd. The last indictment under the constitutionally dubious act was in 1852. The last indictment was in 1852. And the statute wasn't meant to tie the hands of high-level officials of an incoming administration. Former FBI Director James Comey broke protocol by having agents interview Flynn at the White House on his first day on the job, a tactic Comey subsequently told a chortling New York City audience he wouldn't have gotten away with in a more organized administration. Though the agents had a recording of his conversation with the ambassador, they didn't play it for Flynn, instead simply grilling him. The just revealed notes of an FBI official prior to the interview asked whether the goal was to elicit Flynn's admission that he talked with Kislyak about sanctions, the supposed Logan Act violation, or, quote, to get him to lie so we can prosecute him or get him fired, end quote. The notes are open to interpretation, but it's not clear what the FBI was doing besides hoping he'd lie. In a newly disclosed email, Lisa Page suggests slipping in as unobtrusively as possible a warning that lying to the FBI is a crime, so as not to put Flynn on his guard. Still, the agents who interviewed Flynn didn't think he lied. Even if they did, as our own Andrew C. McCarthy has noted, a false statement is not supposed to be actionable unless it is material to something properly under investigation. This paper-thin case, at best, was apparently on the verge of being closed when top FBI officials intervened to keep that from happening. And I reported how some of the documents that came out in the last week reveal that as early as January 4th, the FBI was recommending closing the Flynn case. January 4th, 2017, right before the inauguration. And it was stopped that day and then resulted in the beginning of the Mueller investigation and all the rest. Then the case got picked up by special counsel Mueller's team. Mueller's prosecutors pressured Flynn to plead guilty, hoping he'd help make some sort of case against Trump. That obviously came to nothing, but Flynn has been financially ruined and still faces jail time. As for Flynn's guilty plea, his counsel contends that new disclosures show it was elicited on the basis of threatening his son with prosecution. His son's alleged crime was failing to register with the Justice Department as a foreign agent. Such a violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act had almost never been charged by the Justice Department prior to Mueller's investigation, and it's not even clear the act would apply to Flynn's son. None of this was revealed to the court until now. Now, I think I reported yesterday that there's a law that the Supreme Court upheld that says that the federal prosecutors, if there's exculpatory evidence for prosecution, that they are required by law to hand that over. I think hand it over to the court, if not to the defense. And so it was clearly that the case that this did not happen for Flynn. All right, I got some questions here. Did they mention Turkey? What was the clear violation of law? Oh, for Flynn. So I think they're talking about the Logan Act is that a private citizen cannot communicate with a foreign government on behalf of the government. It's something to that effect, and it was created in 1802 timeframe, and this article does not mention Flynn and Turkey. So that's the question. You'll have to shoot me a link on the turkey thing, and I'll read it. All right, so that's the editorial board of the National Review. And then moving over to the New York Times, this is going to drop down to Tara Reid. He was paid by the Turkish government. There's lots of politicians who've been paid by foreign governments, right? The Clinton Foundation has been paid by a lot of foreign people, I think including foreign governments. Fact check me on that. Okay, Tara Reid. This is starting to slowly unravel Biden. In fact, in the New York Times yesterday, there was a op-ed that Dems should have a plan B. That's actually the title of the article. And then there's another report on Fox that there might be some trouble in the polling with Biden and young voters. And this would make sense because a lot of young voters were enthusiastic about about Bernie Sanders. And so now that Bernie's left the race and endorsed Biden, that the younger crowd of his demographics are disenfranchised and just not really about voting for Biden. But excuse me, this comes from Fox News. Joe Biden's poll numbers. He's in trouble with this key voting block, and then it goes through the poll numbers. So let me see where the poll numbers are. You got to drop down a little bit. Okay. According to, and the reason this stuck out at me is because it's from my alma mater. According to an extensive survey by the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government released in late April, only 34% of Americans aged 18 to 29 say they have a favorable view of the former vice president. So 34%, with just 8% saying they have a very favorable opinion of Biden. In the same survey, 47% of young people said they have an unfavorable view of Biden. Although the percentage of young people who said they have an unfavorable view of President Trump was much higher, 63%, the percent who said that they have a favorable opinion of Trump was only 4 percentage points lower, 30%, than Biden's. So favorable of Biden, 34, favorable of Trump, 30. And quite interestingly, more young people said that they have a very favorable view of Trump, 14%. So very favorable view of Trump, 14. Very favorable view of Biden was 8. Even worse for Biden, when asked if they would rather vote for Trump, Biden, or an independent candidate in 2020, only 39% said that they would choose Biden. 1/4 choose Trump, and a whopping 16% said that they would rather pick an independent. So that's interesting. So 16% would rather pick an independent. We'll see if Justin Amash affects that. And then the other thing that comes to mind is that the latest Gallup poll showed Trump bouncing up to a 49% approval rating, and the main demographic shift, or the main block shift in that poll, was independents. And probably in combination with this information, it would be older independents who started to have a more favorable view of the Trump administration, the current handling of the pandemic. So there you go. That's what it looks like right now. We'll see how all this plays out. I've been saying for a while, I think Biden has two fatal flaws. One is his cognitive decline, which is, I believe, pretty obvious to all of us. Maybe some don't believe it, but if you watch him in interviews, it just seems like things aren't firing like they used to be. And then this Tara Reid thing, I think, is simply going to dog him. Whether it results in any kind of more formal investigation or whatnot, I really don't know, but it's just going to linger there and linger. And it's going to put the woman VP pick, because it's probably going to be a woman, it's going to put that individual in a bind, because very likely she's going to become the main effort of the ticket. Because if Biden is viewed as in decline, and maybe he steps aside before the election, that VP pick is critical. And if you have a woman VP who is made statements in the past about sexual allegations and about Me Too, who is now becoming the vice presidential pick, that's a tricky political thing to navigate. So look out for that. It's going to be interesting to see how the Democrats navigate that. Okay, so let me see if I can. Can I copy this? Bijan Kian guilty Flynn. I'm gonna have to look this up on a different computer. Former business partner Baijan Kian found guilty, 2 charges related to, so his business partner, his former business partner. So this is guilt by association, maybe? Okay, guilty Flynn. Here's the one you want me to look at from last year. So I'm going to do this in real time. Associate Michael Flynn is found guilty of secretly lobbying for Turkey. A business associate, former National Security Advisor Flynn, was convicted on Tuesday in Northern Virginia of secretly lobbying for Turkey, a victory for the government after the judge considered dismissing the case because prosecutors lacked evidence. A judge described the evidence against Mr. Flynn's associate as speculative and very circumstantial, but let the case go on to jury. Judge Trenga could still toss the verdict and scheduled a September 5th hearing on the matter. Okay. During the short trial in federal court in Alexandria, Virginia, prosecutors had accused Mr. Kian and his business partner of trying to subvert the American process when they secretly agreed to work for Turkey. They said that Mr. Kian was operating at Turkey's control and direction. Mr. Kian's defense lawyers repeatedly tried to undercut the government's case, saying there was no actual agreement with the Turkish government to influence American policy. Prosecutors, Mr. Kian's lawyers said, could not even demonstrate that Turkey paid for anything. There's no evidence any Turkish official gave any direction, Mark McDougall, Mr. Kian's lawyer, said on Monday during closing arguments. Later, he added, using another name for Mr. Kian, so now we're all here. You're here because the prosecutors claimed that Mr. Refekian didn't fill out the form the way they would like. So at 67, he was charged last year with conspiracy to violate lobbying laws and failure to register as a foreign agent. He had faced up to 15 years in prison. The jury deliberated for hours before reaching its verdict. So this is a jury verdict. So then it talks about Flynn pleading guilty to lying to the FBI in a separate case. So I guess this is guilt by association. As far as I can tell, Flynn had nothing to do with the Turkey thing. Am I missing something? You know, I could see that his former associate had something to do with Turkey, but it seems like the evidence was, I don't know what evidence they had. It seems like there's no money and there's no document. So I don't know what evidence they presented in court to convince a jury. That might be interesting to see. But yeah, I think this is a separate issue from Flynn pleading guilty to lying to the FBI. I think that the most recent leaks, and that's why all this is very interesting, is that no one's really covering this. No one's really covering these latest leaks. The big media outlets are not covering it. National Review is, The Hill, Jonathan Turley, you know, every conservative's favorite constitutional scholar from the impeachment trial. He came out and basically blasted the Justice Department for this, you know, and the FBI as this was dereliction. This is trouble. He said this should be troubling to any American that the government would be able to do this with their power. So there it is. Make up your own decision. Thanks for the comments. NBC. Let me see this one. NBC News, AMP, and NCNA. Okay, I'll look this up before I let you go. This is good. NCNA, NBC News. I wish that I could just copy it from your link, NCNA News AMP. I think I have to actually type the URL, sadly. Will this pop up? Will this pop up? Okay, I'll read this. Washington Special Counsel Robert Mueller, so this was written in December 4th, 2018. Special Counsel Robert Mueller disclosed more details Tuesday of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn's efforts to cover up the extent of his ties to the government of Turkey while he was a top official on the President Trump's campaign and transition. The documents specifically state that a key component of Flynn's work for Turkey involved the government's efforts to remove from the U.S. a Turkish cleric living in Pennsylvania. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan accuses the cleric Fethullah Gulen of orchestrating a failed coup against him in July 2016. Flynn began working for Turkey about a month later. Federal prosecutors said in the court filing, which refers to Gulen, though not by name, that Flynn's decision not to disclose that he was aiding the Turkish government impeded the ability of the public to learn about the Republic of Turkey's efforts to influence public opinion about the failed coup, including its efforts to effectuate the removal of a person legally residing in the United States. Flynn's false statements about his connection to Turkey were false statements. False statements. What are the false statements? Not to disclose is different than false statements. So it doesn't connect what his false statements were yet. I haven't seen it. False statements. Okay. It just refers to false statements, but it doesn't tell me what the false statements were. Flynn's false statements about his connection to Turkey were included in his plea agreement with Mueller announced in December 2017, but that document described the project simply as focused on U.S. companies' confidence in doing business in Turkey. Tuesday's filing, while more detailed, did not touch on some of the other possible ties between Flynn and Turkey that Mueller's team has looked into, leaving it unclear what, if anything, further may be disclosed at a later time. Looking into whether Flynn met with senior Turkish leaders in December 16, orchestrate the return of Gulen, and a possible deal. So I'm confused. Were these revelations actual hard evidence? Because then it later says, NBC's News reported, for instance, that Mueller's team was looking into whether Flynn met with senior Turkish officials about a possible deal under which Flynn would be paid to orchestrate the return of Gulen to... So is that what this evidence shows? Since the failed coup, Turkey has repeatedly demanded the U.S. extradite Gulen. The Trump White House recently asked federal law enforcement agencies to look into legal ways to remove the cleric from the U.S. in an attempt to ease Erdogan's anger after the Saudi government's murder of Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Flynn did not register with the U.S. government for his 2016 work for Turkey, as is required by law, until almost a month after he was fired as Trump's national security advisor in 2017. Today's court filing confirms that Flynn and his company were paid $530,000 for the work, which ended after Trump won the election in November. Okay, so maybe was this, but this wasn't what he was charged with, was it? Was he charged with this? Did the federal government charge him with this? Because it doesn't seem like they did. It seems like they charged him with lying to the FBI about his conversation with the ambassador of Russia. So, what? There wasn't a charge, unless I'm missing something. Prosecutors further state that Flynn's role as a national security advisor, yada yada, defendant's business relationship with the Republic of Turkey was thus exactly the type of information FARA, I don't know what FARA is, was designed to ensure was within the public sphere, the documents filed Tuesday said. False statements that he had written in an op-ed on election day that was favorable to Erdogan's view of Gulen at his own initiative. It still doesn't tell me what his false statements was. The cleric's responsibility for the coup attempt was a subject of great debate, and the defendant's op-ed about the cleric's role was valuable to the Republic of Turkey's efforts to shape public opinion, prosecutors wrote. Flynn's decision not to disclose Turkey's role in the op-ed again deprived the public of a very transparency FARA was designed to ensure. Okay, foreign agent. FARA must be that foreign agent thing. FARA. I'm assuming that's what the FARA is. Okay. Well, I guess my question would be, what constitutes a foreign agent? Because this would cut every which way but loose, right? I mean, if there is government money being paid to any politician or any politician's son, for example, would that constitute a foreign agent? So when China gives a bunch of money to Joe Biden Jr. to Hunter Biden, or when the Ukraine gives a bunch of money to Hunter Biden, does that mean that Hunter Biden should be, now that's a private company in the case of Ukraine. I'm not sure about China. Would that count towards them? Would the Clinton Foundation receiving foreign money from governments like Saudi Arabia, would they have to be declared as a foreign agent? I don't know. It's not clear. I'd have to know more about the FARA Act to really have a more informed opinion on this topic. What it does seem like is that he was not prosecuted for this Turkey arrangement. And it's not clear whether that was because there was a lack of evidence or because he had already pled guilty. It's not really clear why that would happen. I would think that if there was something to prosecute him on, that even if he had pled guilty to lying about the ambassador thing, then they would still prosecute him for that. No? I mean, why wouldn't they? Oh, after the election? Is that what it is? Established post-presidency? Well, maybe, but I think that maybe that's information I haven't been aware of. So that would, I'd have to look more into that. But if it's interesting so the whole mum silence thing about this Flynn case is, if you had real investigators, journalists, wouldn't they be discussing this in the whole context of the Flynn case? Wouldn't they? And if you just look at the scope of what he was prosecuted for and what he, pled guilty to, that certainly looks like there are some issues. So if this is separate, then this is separate. Isn't that the case? Or is it the ends justify the means because the Obama administration got him on the way out, that they've got to stick with that because of this other presumed violation down the road that was unearthed? So they did extensively. Extensively what? No, I appreciate the information in terms of NBC News and what was the other piece? The New York Times? Yeah, about his business associate. Back at the time they did. I'm talking about now, in light of all these leaks from not leaks, but these revelations from the FBI. I'm talking about now, but maybe COVID's too big. Maybe COVID's too big a story. So, anyway, thanks for watching. Come back tomorrow, and we'll have more. We'll have more on this. I think that was good, and I'll have some time to dig into this and maybe get a fuller opinion on it. So, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you have a great night, and I will talk to you later.